He walked onto the stage in silence. Keanu Reeves, unshaken, unreadable. The host mocked him. The audience laughed. But within minutes, the mood turned. One sentence from Steven Seagal stopped everything. And by the end of the show, the host wasn't laughing, he was crying. What happened on live TV left the world speechless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The cameras were already rolling before the audience even realized it. In the dark, the giant neon letters lit up across the towering digital wall behind the curtain, spelled in flickering red and white. The theme music kicked in like a thunderclap, followed by a sweeping drone shot of the audience who had waited for hours to get a seat in the studio. The show had become infamous not just for its entertainment, but for its ruthlessness, and tonight's episode had already been teased across social media with the tagline, "Peeling Back the Myth of Keanu Reeves." Trent Wallace stepped out from behind the curtain like a man stepping onto a battlefield he had already won. He wore his signature steel gray suit with silver cufflinks, eyes glinting under the spotlight. The crowd responded with thunderous applause, but it wasn't joy. It was anticipation. Trent wasn't just a host. He was a hunter. His show was where public figures came to bleed. He raised his arms to silence the crowd. Then he smiled. "Tonight," he said, pausing for effect, "we have someone different. Someone who doesn't do this often. Someone who barely speaks at all. And that's exactly why we brought him here." The LED wall behind him flashed with a minimalist animation of Keanu Reeves' name. No dramatic explosion, no flashy visuals, just white letters on black, silent, still. He's been called the kindest man in Hollywood, a mystery, a monk. But tonight, Trent said, his grin widening, "We're not bowing to the myth, we're tearing it open." The camera panned back toward the entrance arch. For a moment there was nothing, just the faint hum of air in the studio. Then, slowly, the sound of soft footsteps echoed into the space. No fanfare, no lights pulsing. Just a man walking in, with the kind of stillness that made people forget to clap. Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage dressed in a black t-shirt, worn boots, and a dark jacket that looked older than most of the studio equipment. A crucifix hung lightly around his neck, visible against the fabric. His hair was slightly unkempt. His beard had a few more strands of gray than audiences remembered. He didn't wave. He didn't perform. He just walked. The crowd hesitated, caught between expectation and confusion. A few polite claps, a few murmurs, but the tension was real, thick, electric. Trent extended his hand, smiling like a man with cards tucked up both sleeves. Keanu took the hand with a slight nod and no words. They sat in leather chairs, facing each other across a low glass table. And then, unnoticed by most in the room, a shadow shifted in the far left wing of the stage. Sitting quietly in a chair half turned from the main angle, arms resting on his thighs, was Steven Seagal. No name announced. No camera pointed. Just presence. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But he was watching, and he had been the entire time. The air inside the studio had a strange weight to it, like everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one knew what. Trent leaned forward, fingers laced, his smile sharpening. The audience, trained by seasons of drama and spectacle, sat a little straighter. They were here for a show, and the host never disappointed. Keanu adjusted slightly in his chair, posture open but relaxed. He didn't scan the audience, didn't seek the cameras. He just sat, fully present, his gaze quiet but steady. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something unnerving to a man like Trent, who had built his career on making others flinch. So, Keanu, Trent began, voice smooth as a blade, you've spent the last few decades doing something very rare in Hollywood, staying quiet. No scandals, no chaos, no viral breakdowns, just silence. The crowd chuckled lightly. Keanu didn't. Trent let the pause hang before adding, some people call that dignity. Others call it mystery. But let's be honest, maybe it's just hiding. That got a louder laugh from the crowd, but not from Keanu. He blinked once, slowly, then said nothing. Trent glanced briefly at his cue cards, then back up with a smirk. Don't worry, we'll get there. This isn't just a promo tour, Keanu. This is behind the curtain. We don't do small talk here. The camera cut to a wide shot. The contrast was stark. On one side, Trent, polished and postured, thriving in the spotlight. On the other, Keanu, grounded, unmoved, like he'd brought his own gravity. Meanwhile, off-stage but within view if anyone cared to look, Steven Seagal remained motionless. He hadn't said a word, and still no one had addressed him, but his presence lingered like an unspoken question. Trent tried again. You've played assassins, prophets, messiahs, fallen heroes. But who are you when the camera stops rolling? He leaned in slightly, probing for a reaction. Keanu met his eyes, calm and direct. Someone who doesn't need to be seen to be real. The line was soft but sharp. It didn't come with fanfare, but it landed. A few heads in the audience turned slightly, as if registering a shift they couldn't quite name. Trent smiled wider, but something in his eyes flickered, a small disruption in the script. Okay, he said, I see you came to play. Still, Keanu didn't move. He didn't smile. He just waited. And somewhere in the quiet tension that followed, Steven Seagal uncrossed his legs, subtly repositioning himself in his chair. No one clapped. No one noticed. But the energy in the room had changed. Something had been set in motion, something that couldn't be undone. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the camera slowly zoomed in on the two men seated across from each other. The space between them felt wider than it was. Trent exhaled lightly through his nose, that ever-present smirk returning. Tell me something honest, Keanu. Are you really as calm as you look, or is that just the best acting you've ever done? There it was, the first twist of the knife. Keanu didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. Maybe calm isn't something you perform. Maybe it's something you practice. Trent leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Practice, he repeated. Interesting, because where I come from, calm is the thing people fake when they're about to lose it. The audience gave a short laugh, but it was uncertain, thinner than before. People were watching now, not for comedy, but for cracks, emotional, human. And oddly, the only one not cracking was Keanu. Behind the main conversation, Steven Seagal shifted again. This time he folded his arms across his chest. His eyes didn't leave the stage. A few audience members began to notice him for the first time. Whispers stirred near the back rows, but no one dared speak aloud. Not yet. Trent changed tactics. Let's not pretend you're above all this. You're here. You agreed to come on a show that's built on confrontation. So why? What did you expect would happen? Keanu looked at him. I didn't come here to expect anything. That puzzled Trent for a moment. He paused. Then, what did you come here for? Keanu answered quietly. To see what happens when someone finally listens. The studio went still. It was the kind of stillness that didn't beg for applause, just attention, real attention, the kind that made people lean in without realizing it. Trent looked down at his cue cards. He didn't need them. He had memorized every question, every jab, every corner he planned to box his guest into. But suddenly, the cards felt cheap in his hands. The words, scripted with sharp edges, felt too light for the weight that now filled the room. And sitting there in the dimmed corners of the set, Steven Seagal watched it all unfold, his face unreadable, his body still. But something in his expression suggested he had seen this kind of moment before. The quiet before something real breaks through. The lights above the audience flickered once, then steadied. Trent cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Well," he said, forcing a grin, "I guess tonight might be different after all." And as the camera zoomed in closer on Keanu's face, calm, silent, unshaken, the screen faded to black for a moment. The next segment was about to begin, and no one, not even Trent, knew what was coming next. Trent leaned forward again, this time folding his hands like a priest about to deliver a sermon. The crowd was ready, leaning in, hushed, curious. He gave a tight smile and began. "Keanu, I've got to say you've mastered the art of being interesting while saying almost nothing at all. I mean that as a compliment, sort of." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Keanu offered a faint smile, not amused, not offended, just still. Trent pressed on. "You've been called the most mysterious man in Hollywood, the Zen warrior of cinema, and my favorite, the monk with a motorcycle. That's quite a collection of titles. How do you manage to say so little and still get people to hang on every word?" Keanu glanced at him for a moment, then replied, "Maybe people aren't hanging on the words. Maybe they're looking for something between them." The answer caught Trent off guard, just for a breath. He chuckled, leaning back slightly. "Between them, huh? So, you're a human riddle now?" Keanu didn't respond immediately. The pause spoke more than a full sentence might have. Then, calmly, he said, "Sometimes people talk so much, they forget what they're really trying to say." The laughter that followed wasn't unanimous. Some laughed quickly, too quickly. Others stayed quiet, sensing the shift. Something about Keanu's tone wasn't combative. It was reflective. And that, strangely, made it more disarming. Trent smirked again, adjusting his lapel. "That's deep. I'm almost tempted to get out my incense and meditate. But seriously, let's talk about this silence thing. Most actors promote, talk, post, perform, but you disappear. Why is that?" Keanu looked at him without blinking. "Because I don't think life needs an audience to be real." That answer pulled the air a little tighter. It wasn't a jab. It was just a truth. One that sounded simple, but landed like a stone dropped into still water. Trent gave a slow nod, tapping his cue cards against his thigh. Okay. So we're going to play it that way? You're not giving me the usual answers, are you?" Keanu shrugged gently. "I didn't come to play anything." The audience laughed again, but this time it wasn't clear who they were laughing at. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others looked toward Trent, waiting to see how he'd respond. Trent narrowed his eyes just slightly. "You know, some people might say that's convenient. Stay quiet long enough, people will project what they want onto you. The mystique becomes the message." Keanu's voice was low but steady. Or maybe the noise just gets in the way. Trent shifted slightly in his chair, but his smile remained. "You've got this whole still water thing going on, people eat it up. But let me ask you something a little sharper." He leaned in, voice dipping just enough to signal a change in temperature. "Are you quiet because you have nothing to say? Or because you've got too much to hide?" A few people gasped lightly. Some laughed, unsure if they were supposed to. The silence that followed was heavy. Keanu didn't blink. He sat still, eyes focused. Not everything worth saying needs to be said out loud. That response didn't land the way Trent wanted. He was fishing for defensiveness, or maybe even a crack. But what he got was a kind of strength he didn't know how to frame. It wasn't armor. It was presence. Trent tried to brush past the moment. "All right, let's try this another way. You've had decades in this business. Fame, fortune, tragedy. You've lived through more than most people can imagine. Yet, you don't do memoirs, no tell-all interviews. Don't you think people deserve to know the real you? Keanu looked at him calmly. If someone needs to be known, maybe it's not the world's job to know them. Maybe it's their job to know themselves. There was a murmur in the audience. Something thoughtful, even a few quiet nods. Trent chuckled again, but it was starting to sound thinner. You speak in riddles. Do you ever give a straight answer? Keanu didn't change his expression. I give the answer I believe in. Whether it's straight depends on the question. Trent pressed his tongue to his cheek and gave a theatrical shrug. Fair enough. Let's play your game for a moment. Tell me one thing people always get wrong about you. Keanu tilted his head. That? I want to be figured out. The crowd responded with a low hum of appreciation. A few claps emerged, but no one dared start an applause break. The energy in the room wasn't one of performance anymore. It was something else. Something quieter. Trent gave a laugh that was just a little too loud. You know what's funny? This was supposed to be a show about exposing people, about getting under the surface. And here you are, saying so little and still turning the mirror around. Keanu offered the smallest smile yet. Sometimes the truth isn't in the answers, it's in the silence after the question. Trent looked down at his notes. For the first time, he didn't seem to know what to say next. And from the side of the stage, Steven Seagal remained silent, watching, still waiting. Trent sat back, tapping his cue cards against his palm like they might give him a new idea. All right, he said slowly, his tone shifting again. Let's go simpler. What do you think people see when they look at you? Keanu's answer came almost immediately. The version of themselves they hope I am. That line made several people in the crowd shift in their seats. It wasn't said with arrogance or self-pity, just observation, honest, unfiltered, and somehow a little heartbreaking. Trent blinked, caught off guard by the directness. You think people project onto you? Keanu nodded gently. All the time. We all do that, don't we? With strangers, with actors, with family. We see what we need to see. There was a strange stillness in the studio now. The lights hadn't changed, but the air had. Trent cleared his throat. And what do you see when you look at yourself? Keanu looked down for a moment, then back up. Someone still learning how to show up without hiding. For the first time that night, Trent didn't respond with a quip. His fingers stopped tapping. His smile didn't appear. It was like the air had been let out of a balloon, but instead of collapse, there was space. Real space. Is that hard for you? Trent asked. His voice was quieter now. Keanu gave a small nod. It's hard for everyone. A pause, then Trent tried again to reclaim the rhythm. You know, I built this show on the idea that people are tired of pretense. They want the raw stuff, the truth, the tears. But you're sitting here giving me stillness. Keanu responded softly. Stillness can be truth, too. Another ripple through the audience. This one felt different. Not admiration, not applause. Understanding. Trent took a breath, his confidence beginning to wear thin. You make this hard, Keanu. I can't decide if you're deflecting or just refusing to perform. Keanu didn't hesitate. Maybe I'm just showing up, as I am. That sentence hit something deep. Trent looked toward the audience, maybe hoping for a laugh or a nod, but they weren't giving him the usual feedback. They weren't watching a show anymore. They were witnessing a shift. Off to the side, Steven Seagal leaned forward ever so slightly. His eyes were steady, focused, still silent. Trent glanced his way, just for a beat, and then looked back at Keanu. You're good, he said finally. You've mastered the art of saying nothing and meaning everything. Keanu looked at him, gentle but unwavering. Or maybe I've stopped trying to mean anything and just let things be. The lights above flickered once more. This time, no one moved. And in that strange stillness, something unspoken passed between the host, the guest, and the audience. The performance was cracking, and the conversation was just beginning. Trent stared at Keanu, then smiled like a magician ready to reveal the trick. "You know what I think?" he said, loud enough for the audience to perk up. "I think you've built the most brilliant brand in Hollywood." Without saying a single word. A few audience members laughed. Others stayed silent, unsure of where this was headed. Trent leaned forward again, elbows resting on his knees. "Let's be honest here. People love a good monk story. The quiet warrior, the man of mystery, the one who doesn't speak unless he has to. It's poetic. It's cinematic. But isn't that all it is? A performance." Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked at Trent with the same unshaken calm, as if he had heard this question before. Maybe not with words, but in stares, in whispers, in the constant weight of assumption. Trent continued, pressing the point. "Come on, man. You're telling me you don't see how people eat this up? The silence, the tragic backstory, the motorcycle rides through nowhere. It's compelling. It's perfect. It's sellable." The laughter returned, hesitant but louder this time. Keanu sat still, unbothered. Then he looked up and said in a steady tone, "Stillness isn't a brand. It's a decision." The words landed like a brick on velvet. Quiet, but undeniable. A few people in the audience stopped laughing altogether. The energy shifted again, something subtle but immediate. Trent raised his eyebrows. "A decision," he repeated, almost mockingly. "That's a very philosophical way to avoid the question." Keanu responded without changing expression. "You asked if it was a gimmick," I answered. Trent gave a dry chuckle. "You know, sometimes I wonder, if you walk around like this all the time, just staring into the middle distance and dropping fortune cookie wisdom." That got a few scattered chuckles, but they were shorter this time, less certain. Keanu finally smiled, a soft one, not amused, not sarcastic, just present. "I walk around like a person, some days quiet, some days loud, but always myself." Trent rolled his eyes just slightly. "So, the quiet is you?" "It's part of me, just like your voice is part of you," Keanu said, gently. There was no heat in his voice, no bite, just clarity. Steven Seagal shifted slightly in his seat at the edge of the stage. His presence hadn't been addressed, but his attention hadn't wavered either. His gaze was fixed on the exchange, like someone who had seen this kind of conversation play out many times before. Trent seemed to register something was changing, but didn't know how to stop it. He turned back to the audience with his signature grin, hoping for a little reinforcement. "Guys," he said, gesturing toward Keanu. "I mean, seriously, don't we all want to believe he's just like us, only cooler and quieter?" But this time, the audience didn't laugh. They just watched. Trent's grin faltered ever so slightly as the silence stretched longer than expected. The applause sign above the audience flickered, but nobody moved. It wasn't rebellion. It was something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. A willingness to see what would happen next without being told how to feel. Keanu sat unmoved, letting the quiet linger. Then he spoke, measured and low. "I never asked to be cooler, or quieter. I just stopped trying to be louder." That made Trent blink. He hadn't expected a response so direct. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a few seconds, all he could do was look down at his cue cards. They suddenly looked flimsy in his hands. He tried to recover with charm. "So you're saying silence is your..." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I'm saying it's my responsibility." That puzzled Trent. Responsibility? To who? Keanu looked him in the eyes. "To the people who are hurting. To the ones who live in noise all day and just want to breathe." The room felt like it inhaled as one, A wave of subtle stillness passed through the rows of seats. Phones weren't raised. No one whispered. They were just there. Trent chuckled nervously, brushing invisible lint from his jacket sleeve. So what, now you're a healer too? Keanu didn't rise to the bait. No. Just someone who's learned how not to cause more pain. The sentence was soft, but it cut through everything else. It bypassed the defenses, the sarcasm, the performance, and landed somewhere real. Trent's voice sharpened a little, a reflex more than a decision. But don't you think this whole silent sage thing is a little, how should I put it, convenient? You say very little, people fill in the blanks. You're praised for what you don't say. Keanu gave a small nod. Maybe. Or maybe people are just tired of being told what to think. That struck something. A few audience members nodded. Others looked down, processing. Trent reached for control again. I've made a career out of being loud. I say what people are afraid to say. Keanu didn't argue. He simply replied, Then why are you so afraid of the quiet? The question lingered. It wasn't meant to wound. It was meant to reflect. And it did. All over Trent's face. From the side of the stage, Steven Seagal sat with his arms crossed. Still silent. Still watching. His presence was like a shadow that grew larger every time Trent raised his voice. Trent tried to laugh it off. You're really flipping the script on me here, man. Keanu didn't blink. Maybe the script needed to be flipped. And in that moment, the audience realized this wasn't just another interview. It was something else. Something honest, trying to break through the noise. Trent leaned back, his posture more defensive now. You know, he said, trying to regain footing, when I first booked you on the show, I was excited. I thought, here's a guy who barely talks. Let's get him to crack. Let's see what's underneath the silence. Keanu met his eyes. You don't have to crack people to see them. Trent scoffed lightly. Maybe, but I've made a living doing it. And what's it cost you? Keanu asked. That stopped Trent. The question wasn't aggressive, it was quiet, but it carried weight. Real weight. He looked down again, as if the cue cards might offer him protection. Then he laughed, but it wasn't the confident kind. You're good at this. You turn everything into a mirror. I don't try to, Keanu said simply. Sometimes stillness does that on its own. There it was again. That calm. Not cold. Not distant, just present. The kind of presence that didn't seek power, but held it anyway. The kind that didn't fill space. It opened it. The audience remained quiet. Not bored, not disengaged, just listening. The studio, built for entertainment, now held something sacred. Trent shifted in his seat. I used to think silence was weakness, that it meant you didn't know what to say. Keanu nodded slightly. Sometimes silence means you know exactly what not to say. Another wave of stillness moved through the crowd. Trent looked around, almost nervously now. It's weird. Usually by this point we're deep into the headlines, the scandals, the internet rumors, but with you, there's nothing to drag out. There's always something, Keanu replied. But not everything deserves to be dragged into a spotlight. That landed, especially for an audience raised on oversharing and viral clips. Steven Seagal finally uncrossed his arms, leaning slightly forward in his chair. He still hadn't spoken, but his posture shifted, like someone preparing to say something. Not yet, but soon. Trent gave one last attempt at regaining control. So what's your angle, Keanu? Come on. No one stays this quiet for this long without a purpose. Keanu gave him a look. Soft. Steady. Maybe the purpose is to make space. For what matters. For what's real. Trent blinked, lips parting, but no sound came out. The moment stretched. The audience didn't fidget. They didn't whisper. They waited. Because for the first time in the show's history, someone wasn't trying to be clever or shocking or loud. He was just being, and that, somehow, was louder than anything else. The camera panned wide again. Trent set his cue cards down beside him, a little too carefully. And Steven Seagal, silent still, lowered his eyes like a judge waiting for the right moment to speak. But for now, only the quiet remained. And for once, no one tried to fill it. Trent leaned forward again, eyes narrowing just slightly, the cards now forgotten on the table beside him. The studio had grown still, eerily so for a space built on applause and sound bites. He sensed his usual rhythm was gone, his tricks weren't working, and that's when something more dangerous emerged. He pushed past the persona, past the banter. He decided to confront. "Let me ask you something directly," he said, tone tighter now. "What are you so afraid of?" A few people in the audience inhaled audibly. It wasn't the kind of question that belonged in a safe, controlled interview. It was designed to provoke, to rattle, to strike a chord no one had permission to touch. But Keanu didn't flinch. He looked at Trent for a long second. Not angry, not defensive, just steady. "Not fear," he replied, "just respect for what words can't carry." The answer silenced the room. Trent chuckled awkwardly, trying to shake off the moment. "That's a beautiful line, very poetic. But let's be real, everyone's afraid of something." Keanu nodded. "That's true, but fear isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's the warning before you speak too soon." Trent gripped the edge of his seat, pushing now. "So, what's your warning, Keanu? What are the things you don't talk about because they might expose too much?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Pain, loss, grief, those aren't interview topics. They're lived in silence, felt when no one's watching. The words hit harder than expected. There was no drama in the delivery, no pause for effect, just raw truth, dropped gently into the space between them. Trent let out a breath and tried again. "Okay, but don't you think silence gives people the wrong idea? Like you're trying to hide something? Or worse, that you think you're above the rest of us?" Keanu shook his head. "Silence isn't a wall. It's a window. Most people are just too loud to notice what's on the other side." For the first time, Trent didn't smile. His usual armor, the sharp wit, the smug grin, was beginning to peel at the edges. He sat back slightly, not in surrender, but in hesitation. "You're not making this easy," he muttered. "I didn't come here to make it easy," Keanu replied gently. "I came here to be honest." The audience remained locked in, not a cough, not a shuffle, just complete presence. Off to the side, Steven Seagal watched with a quiet intensity. He hadn't spoken, but his posture had changed. One hand rested under his chin now, like someone listening for more than just words. Trent looked over at Keanu again. "You know, most people would have taken offense by now." Keanu gave a small nod. "That's the difference between being attacked and being questioned." Trent exhaled through his nose, the tension settling across his shoulders like a coat he couldn't quite shake off. He shifted in his seat again, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "All right then," he said. "Let's talk about what you don't say." Keanu didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Trent leaned in. "You've been through things, personal things, tragedy, public loss, but you never talk about it. You let people speculate, fill in the blanks. That's your right, sure, but don't you think there's a line between privacy and evasion?" Keanu blinked once. "There's also a line between curiosity and intrusion." That landed harder than Trent expected. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out for a beat. Then he recovered. "So, you're saying this, what we're doing now, is intrusion?" Keanu shook his head. "No, I'm saying people sometimes ask for pieces of someone they haven't earned the right to hold." The room fell into deeper silence. the kind that made people shift their weight but not their gaze. Trent cleared his throat. Okay, then help me understand. Why even come on this show? You knew I'd push. You knew I'd poke. Why walk into the fire if you don't want to burn? Keanu looked at him, calm as ever. Maybe because I wanted to see if someone could ask a real question without setting the room on fire. A few people in the audience looked up sharply at that. It wasn't an insult. It was an invitation. Trent sat back again. His voice dropped a little. You think that's what I do? Burn people for the camera? Keanu didn't answer right away. Then softly, I think sometimes the performance gets in the way of the truth. For all of us. The words were slow, measured, but they slid into the cracks of the studio like water through a canyon. Trent rubbed his palms together. So what's the truth you're bringing here, Keanu? What's the thing that actually matters? Keanu's tone didn't change. That we don't need to perform pain to make it real. The crowd remained frozen. The cameras, usually panning to catch laughter or reaction, now stayed fixed on the stillness. It was a different kind of tension now. Not hostile, just exposed. Trent folded his arms. You lost your sister when you were young, didn't you? Keanu nodded. She was 22. Trent's voice softened. And you were in the middle of a film shoot? Yes. Trent didn't follow, with a joke this time. He didn't pivot. He just said, that must have been impossible. Keanu nodded again. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that screams. There were no words from the audience, just silence, real, heavy, respectful silence. Steven Seagal sat straighter now, watching Keanu more closely. Because even Trent knew this wasn't composure anymore. It was something deeper. Trent looked down, his hands clasped together now, no longer trying to perform, just sitting with the words that hung in the air. How do you keep going after that? He asked, voice lower. After a loss that deep? Keanu didn't blink. You don't keep going, you keep carrying. Trent looked up, clearly moved. Carrying what? The parts of them that didn't get to finish, Keanu said. Their laughter, their light, their pain. All of it. You carry it until you learn how to walk with it instead of fight it. A soft breath swept across the crowd, as if everyone exhaled at once. Not from discomfort, but from recognition. Trent's expression had changed. He looked more like a man asking for something than a host delivering questions. Is that why you're quiet? He asked. Because the noise makes you forget what you're carrying? Keanu nodded. Sometimes the noise pretends to help, but it never heals. The words were barely above a whisper, but they cut through the space like a siren in the dark. Trent swallowed hard. You know, he said, I spent most of my career believing the opposite. That noise was power. That if you were loud enough, clever enough, relentless enough, you couldn't be touched. Keanu looked at him with eyes that didn't judge. And do you still believe that? Trent hesitated. I don't know. Steven Seagal leaned forward slightly. He still hadn't spoken, but now his presence was being felt in every corner of the room. The tension had turned into something else. Not a battle, a reckoning. Trent glanced sideways at him, then back to Keanu. You haven't cracked once this entire time, he said. Not even when I pushed you. Not even when I questioned everything people think you are. Keanu gave a faint smile. Maybe you weren't cracking me. Maybe you were chipping away at the noise around both of us. That line didn't just shift the room. It turned the atmosphere. Suddenly, the audience wasn't just watching an interview. They were witnessing something unravel. Quietly, respectfully, powerfully. Trent didn't even try to laugh anymore. His voice was soft now. What do you do when everything you built is noise? Keanu replied, You listen for the silence underneath it. The studio lights dimmed a little more, almost as if matching the tone of the moment. No one dared move. Not a sound came from the crowd. Trent finally leaned back, not in retreat, but in surrender. "That's the thing about silence," he whispered. "It only scares you when you've been hiding too long." Keanu didn't answer. He just looked at him, present, steady. And in that stillness, for the first time all night, Trent Wallace didn't have a single word left to fill the space. The air had grown heavy, like the room itself was leaning in closer. Trent crossed one leg over the other, clearly trying to collect himself. Then he forced a smile, tight, uncertain, and leaned forward again. "So tell me, Keanu," he said, voice rising just a touch with forced lightness. "When's the last time you cried?" A few in the audience chuckled nervously. It was the kind of question meant to reset the mood, to jolt things back toward entertainment. But the laughter faded almost immediately. Keanu didn't blink. "Last night." Trent froze. The crowd fell silent. He opened his mouth as if to follow up with a joke, but nothing came. His eyes searched Keanu's face for sarcasm, or irony, or even mischief, but none was there. Just truth. Keanu continued in a steady voice. "I was reading a letter from the hospice nurse who sat with my sister in her final days. That changed everything. The room didn't just go quiet, it softened, like even the walls were listening now." Trent sat still. Keanu didn't perform. He didn't sigh for effect. He just kept going. "She wrote about how my sister used to stay awake late into the night, not because of the pain, but because she didn't want the nurse to feel alone." Several audience members looked down. One woman in the second row covered her mouth. No one moved. Keanu's voice remained even. "She said my sister used to hum old songs from when we were kids, not for herself, but to calm everyone else in the room." Trent leaned back slowly in his chair. His hands had stopped fidgeting. There was no comeback forming on his lips now. Keanu looked down for a moment, then up again. "There's grief that never leaves. You just learn how to walk with it. You carry it like something sacred." No one clapped. No one dared interrupt. "It's not a moment that passes," he continued. "It's a landscape you learn how to live inside." Steven Seagal was now leaning forward with both elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely. His gaze was locked on Keanu, his breathing slow, almost meditative. Still, he didn't speak. He just absorbed. Trent finally broke the silence. His voice was lower now, real. "Why don't you ever talk about her?" "About that?" Keanu looked at him, not harshly, but like someone who had waited a long time for that question to be asked sincerely. "Because most people only listen to pain when it's dressed up like strength," he said. "And sometimes it's just pain." There were no lights flashing, no music cue, nothing but the sound of breathing. And somehow, that said more than any headline ever could. Trent stared at Keanu, the expression on his face shifting from intrigue to something closer to humility. His voice had lost its edge. "You carry her with you all the time, don't you?" Keanu nodded slowly. "Every day, in small ways, in quiet ones." Trent asked softly, "Like what?" Keanu took a quiet breath. "When I'm on set, I keep a small stone in my jacket pocket. It was hers. I found it in her apartment after she passed. She said it reminded her of a river near our childhood home. I don't think anyone else would notice it, but I always know it's there." A hush settled even deeper over the audience. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was something closer to a eulogy, a remembrance wrapped in simplicity. Keanu continued, his voice unwavering. "When I see people smile through pain, I think of her. When I see someone choose kindness even when they're breaking inside, I think of her." Trent swallowed hard. "Did you get to say goodbye?" Keanu's eyes lowered. "Not the way I wanted to. I was filming overseas. They called me too late. I flew back as fast as I could, but by the time I reached the hospital, she was already unconscious." Trent didn't speak. No one did. Keanu looked up. I sat with her for hours. I told her stories from when we were kids. I told her I'd take care of her favorite plant, that I'd keep the light on, that I'd remember the sound of her laugh. He paused. I don't know if she heard me, but I like to think she did. The audience was still. Many had tears in their eyes. One man near the back quietly removed his glasses and wiped his face. Trent cleared his throat. That's heavy. It's life, Keanu said simply. It doesn't always give you the closure you want, but it gives you moments, and sometimes moments are enough. Trent leaned forward again, this time not as a performer but as a person. What did that moment teach you? Keanu didn't rush the answer. That saying goodbye doesn't end love. That silence doesn't mean absence. And that carrying someone with you doesn't mean you're stuck. It means you've made space for them. Steven Seagal shifted slightly in his chair. His expression had softened. He looked at Keanu the way a soldier might look at another across a battlefield they'd both survived. Still, he said nothing. Trent glanced at his discarded cue cards, then back at Keanu. And what about now? What do you do when the grief sneaks back in? Keanu replied, I let it sit beside me. I don't push it away. I let it speak, and then I breathe. And just like that, a man who had said so little had managed to say everything. Trent rested his elbows on his knees, his usual poise stripped down to something rawer. You know, he said slowly, people think this job, talking for a living, gives us control. But sometimes, when you speak like that, it feels like everything I've ever said was just noise. Keanu didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer pity. Just understanding. Words aren't wrong, he said, but they're not always enough. Trent gave a faint laugh, not because anything was funny, but because the truth was starting to settle in places he hadn't let it reach before. I used to think silence meant failure. Like if I didn't say something smart or fast or powerful, I'd disappear. Keanu tilted his head. Maybe that's when the real you finally shows up. Trent's eyes glistened for just a second before he looked down. He didn't wipe them. He didn't hide. I haven't cried on this set once in 5 years, he admitted, voice shaking. Not once. I've roasted politicians, exposed scandals, made celebrities storm off. But now, he stopped, swallowed, looked at Keanu. Now I feel like I'm the one being seen. Keanu nodded softly. It's hard. Trent gave a broken smile. Yeah, it is. Then Keanu leaned forward, his voice quiet but steady. That pain doesn't make you weak, Trent. It makes you honest. There was a beat of silence. Then another. The kind of pause that no camera angle or clever edit could replicate. Keanu continued, My sister once said, you don't have to be loud to be strong, you just have to stay. She stayed. Even when it was hard, even when her body gave up, her heart didn't. Trent rubbed the side of his face, eyes wet now. And you've been carrying that strength ever since. Keanu nodded. Not just hers, my own. The version of it she helped me find. Trent looked up again. You ever think about what she'd say now, if she could see you here? Keanu took a breath. She'd probably laugh and say, You really sat through an interview? Then she'd remind me that presence is more important than words, that showing up is enough. From the edge of the stage, Steven Seagal finally leaned forward just slightly, almost as if preparing to speak. But he didn't. His presence remained anchored, quiet, like a guardian of the moment. Trent smiled through his tears. I thought I invited you here to get under your skin. Keanu gave the faintest nod. Maybe you did. But sometimes when you dig deep enough, you find your own reflection. And in that moment, vulnerability didn't feel like defeat. It felt like a beginning. The cameras kept rolling, but no one was performing anymore. Trent sat frozen for a moment, caught in a silence he hadn't planned for. Around him, the studio no longer pulsed with the rhythm of a live show. The lighting hadn't changed, but it felt dimmer somehow. Not darker, just quieter. Keanu hadn't moved from his seat. He hadn't leaned forward. He hadn't made a single dramatic gesture. And yet, the gravity in the room had changed completely. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't intimidation. It was something much rarer. It was presence. The kind of presence that didn't have to raise its voice, it simply existed, and everything else leaned toward it. The audience leaned forward, not in excitement, but in reverence. Something unspoken was happening, and none of them wanted to miss it. Trent cleared his throat. Then again. His eyes darted toward the monitor near the camera, where usually he could glimpse his angle, his smile, his control. Now, all he saw was himself, sitting across from a man who refused to play the game. He wiped his hand across his forehead quickly, a subtle gesture, but not subtle enough. The sweat had formed there without permission. "So," he said, his tone suddenly too high, too bright. "This is the part where I usually tell a joke to lighten the mood. You know, crack something about my ex-wife or the last politician who walked off the stage." The audience didn't laugh. He smiled wider, trying again. "Or maybe I just admit that the guy who barely speaks is winning the interview." Still no laughter. In fact, a few people in the audience frowned, not in offense, but in confusion. They weren't sure what Trent was trying to do anymore. And for the first time in his own studio, Trent felt it. He wasn't leading, he was following. Keanu hadn't spoken since the last moment of vulnerability. He simply looked across the space between them. Not condescending, not passive-aggressive, just fully present. Trent let out a small breath and reached again, desperate now for something to grab onto. Okay, so let's flip the script for a second. Let's say I stop performing, right? Let's say I strip away the humor, the edge, the whole thing. What's left?" Keanu answered softly. "That's the question, isn't it?" Trent stared at him. Keanu continued. "You've spent years in this chair, guiding the conversation, controlling the light. But the light isn't always truth. Sometimes it just blinds us to what's real." The words weren't harsh, but they landed hard. Trent glanced toward the camera again, but this time he didn't see the lens. He saw his reflection in it. The mask he wore so easily, now faltering at the edges. He chuckled weakly, one last attempt. "So, now I'm the one in therapy." Keanu tilted his head. "Or maybe you're just finally hearing yourself." Trent shifted in his seat. The laughter he'd hoped for never came. He looked to the audience, expecting at least a chuckle, a glance of reassurance, anything. But what met him was a sea of quiet faces. Some reflective, some wide-eyed, some softened by emotion. Not a single one was amused. The host rubbed the back of his neck, his voice now losing the polish it once carried. This wasn't supposed to go this way." Keanu didn't move. What way was it supposed to go? "I don't know," Trent muttered, staring at the floor briefly. "I thought I'd ask a few hard questions, get a few viral sound bites, maybe push you enough to make the mystery crack." "And then what?" Keanu asked gently. Trent glanced at him. "Then I'd move on. We'd both move on." Keanu nodded slowly. "But maybe some things aren't meant to be cracked. Maybe they're meant to be held." Trent's eyes welled slightly, and he blinked quickly to push it back. "You're doing something here, Keanu. I can't quite name it, but it's real, it's uncomfortable, and it's real." Keanu let the silence speak for a few seconds before responding. Uncomfortable doesn't mean bad, it just means unpracticed. That line made a few in the audience take deep breaths. Some nodded, some closed their eyes. It was hitting them too, not just the host. Trent tried to laugh again. It came out wrong. "I've had 1,000 guests on this stage, politicians, celebrities, CEOs. They all came here with a pitch, a script, a shield. You didn't bring any of that. You brought this." Keanu nodded, still calm. "Because I don't believe in using pain as a performance." The line was quiet, but it echoed. Everyone heard it. Trent looked over at the cue cards he had discarded earlier. One of them had slipped onto the floor. A sharp question printed in bold font. "Why are you so mysterious?" He stared at it, then looked back at Keanu. "You're not mysterious. You're just honest. And honesty these days feels like a foreign language." Keanu offered a soft smile. "Maybe we're all just trying to remember how to speak it." Trent exhaled. He was visibly unraveling, but not in the way a man breaks. More like a man who finally stops holding in too much breath. Steven Seagal, seated quietly to the left, hadn't moved much, but the shift in his eyes was unmistakable. He no longer looked like a silent guest waiting for his cue. He looked like a witness to something sacred. And Trent, once the center of every room he entered, was now standing at the edge of something he couldn't control. He didn't fight it. For once, he just sat in it. Still, quiet, present. Trent looked out at the audience, then at the floor, then back at Keanu, his posture shifting from host to human. Someone in the middle of an unscripted moment. "I think this show, this whole setup, I thought it was about exposing, about reaching a moment," he said quietly. "But maybe it's about becoming." Keanu's gaze softened. "Maybe it's both." Trent swallowed, visibly caught between the performance he lived in and the truth unfolding before him. "You're changing the room, Keanu. I can feel it, like gravity. You don't need to raise your voice. You just pull us in." Keanu gave a small nod. Presence doesn't need presence. The audience shifted again, leaning forward, hearts pounding in unison. The energy had changed from mere expectation to reverence. They were witnessing something rare. Sincere connection. Trent's forehead creased. He looked to the ceiling for a moment, maybe hoping the lights would guide him back to the script. They didn't. Instead, they stayed still, accentuating the stillness that had taken over. He exhaled slowly. "I'm losing control of the show, aren't I?" Keanu responded softly. "Maybe you're just finding control differently." Trent blinked and let out a fragile laugh. "That's a really nice line." Keanu looked away briefly, then gently smiled. "Not nice. True." Trent looked at his hands. He flexed them, relaxed them. And then, surprising everyone still, he placed his palms flat on his thighs, a gesture of surrender. He wasn't hiding behind wit anymore. He was here. Unclear, unprogrammed, alive. Steven Seagal, long silent, exhaled audibly. It was one of the few sounds in the room now, and yet it echoed across the studio. Trent looked across at him, nodding slowly, as if acknowledging his presence for the first time. He turned back to Keanu. "You know, I thought being the loudest voice was power. Turns out, or maybe just right now, it's about being the stillest." He paused, letting the words land. "I'm not going to pretend I have a killer line to break the silence." Keanu met his eyes. "Then don't." So Trent didn't. He simply sat there with him. No applause, no music, no cue lights. Just two men who had entered the room with different intentions and found something more. The camera lingered on their faces, capturing the moment in unedited clarity. The show had shifted from spectacle to soul. And as the shot held, the audience sat in complete hush, bearing witness, awakening to the gravity of honesty. That was the power of presence. And in that presence, Trent Wallace realized that some moments weren't meant to be spoken, they are meant to be felt. The screen faded to black. The next segment would begin, but something in the studio had already changed. The studio lights had not dimmed, but everything felt softer now. The tension of performance had drained out of the space, leaving behind something unfamiliar to a room built on applause. Stillness. Trent sat, quieter than he ever had on camera. The audience waited for his next move, but for once, he wasn't directing the energy. He glanced up toward Keanu, expecting another soft but powerful truth, another story wrapped in silence. But this time, Keanu didn't answer. He asked, "Do you ever listen to yourself?" Keanu said gently, "without the performance?" Trent blinked. The words landed like a note held too long in a quiet room. Not loud, not accusatory, but so honest. They scraped away the layer he didn't know was still on. Trent opened his mouth, then hesitated, his eyebrows pulled together slightly. "What do you mean by that?" Keanu didn't elaborate. He just held the silence open. Trent leaned back, caught off guard by the shift. "You're flipping it again. I'm the one supposed to be asking questions." Keanu stayed still. Sometimes the right question finds the right person. Trent tried to chuckle, but it didn't carry the usual rhythm. He looked down at the table in front of him, then rubbed his palm against his pant leg. "Without the performance," he repeated quietly. Then he looked up. "I'm not sure I know how to separate the two anymore." Keanu said nothing. He didn't rescue him from the silence. He let him sit in it. Trent breathed in, his voice smaller than it had ever been on the show. "When I'm on camera, I can feel the lines forming in my head before anyone says a word. The joke, the twist, the setup for the applause line. It happens automatically now. I don't even think about it." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's not unusual, but it scares me," Trent added quickly, "because now I do it when I'm not on camera, too." The confession cracked through the last of his shield. The audience didn't move. They were frozen in empathy, not discomfort. "I talk to my wife like I'm hosting," he continued. "To my son, too. I'm always on, always trying to steer the moment, shape it, win it." Keanu waited, then asked again, "So what would it sound like if you weren't performing?" Trent looked stunned. "I don't know." Keanu didn't press, he just sat with him. Trent swallowed hard. "When my son tells me about his day, I nod. I throw in a, 'That's crazy,' or 'Really?' But I'm not actually there. I'm just doing the rhythm." Keanu looked him in the eyes. And what would it mean to be there? The pause that followed was longer than anything that had come before. And yet, not one person in the room looked away. Trent leaned forward slowly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He wasn't looking at the cameras anymore. He wasn't thinking about his audience, his ratings, or the sharp monologue he usually ended with. For the first time in years, he looked like someone trying to find the words, not to impress, but to understand himself. "I think it would mean actually listening," he finally said. "Not waiting for the moment to respond, not filling space because silence makes me feel small." Keanu remained still. He didn't nod, didn't smile. He let the truth hang. Trent continued, quieter now. "When my son was younger, he used to sit on the floor next to me while I edited show clips on my laptop. He'd bring Legos and build castles beside my chair. I'd smile and tell him they looked cool, but I never looked. I just kept typing." His voice caught slightly. "Then one day he stopped bringing them. He'd sit across the room and just stare out the window. I didn't notice until weeks later." Keanu spoke gently. "Did you ever ask why?" Trent shook his head. "No. I was too busy shaping the next episode." The audience was still. There wasn't a phone screen in sight, no shifting in seats. They were locked in, not with entertainment, but with something more uncomfortable and more important. Trent looked back at Keanu. "You ask if I've ever listened to myself without the performance? I don't think I have. I don't think I wanted to." "May we not?" Keanu asked. "Because I was afraid of what I'd hear," Trent admitted. "That maybe I wasn't enough without the suit, the lights, the name on the wall. Keanu looked at him, not as a critic, but as someone who understood the cost of masks. The world rewards performance, but connection doesn't come from applause, it comes from presence. Trent gave a soft, broken laugh. Yeah, well, presence doesn't trend. It does, in the right hearts, Keanu said softly. Trent wiped his palms on his knees. When you asked me that question, it hit harder than any insult I've ever gotten. Because it didn't accuse me, it invited me. And that's harder to deflect. Keanu didn't respond. He just let him speak. Trent looked around the room slowly. I've made a living talking, but right now, I think the most honest thing I've ever done on this stage is sit here and say nothing. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was earned. Steven Seagal adjusted his posture slightly, as if acknowledging the shift in the room, still silent, still observing, but now visibly more engaged. The host took another deep breath. I don't know who I am without the performance, he said, and for the first time, he looked like he truly wanted to find out. Trent sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, his jaw tense. Then he let out a breath, slow, shaky but deliberate. You know what scares me the most? He asked. It's not being wrong on air. It's not getting canceled or losing the crowd. Keanu listened without interrupting. It's silence, Trent said. Not yours, mine. When the lights go down and I'm sitting in my dressing room alone, I don't know what to do with it. It's too loud, like everything I've ignored comes rushing in. Keanu nodded slowly. Because silence doesn't hold back, it reflects everything. Trent's eyes glistened. I used to think if I filled every second with words, I could keep the hard stuff out. But now, I think I was just keeping myself out. The line hovered in the space like a confession no one dared to judge. Keanu leaned forward slightly. Do you want to keep doing that? Trent blinked at the question. Then, after a pause, he shook his head. No. I'm tired, Keanu. I'm tired of pretending that cleverness means connection. I'm tired of talking to fill the void. And I'm tired of hearing my own voice and realizing it doesn't sound like me anymore. Keanu looked at him with calm steadiness. Then maybe it's time to hear what does. Trent bit his lip. I don't know how. You start with one breath, Keanu said, then another, and you stay. The audience remained silent, not from awkwardness, but out of respect. They weren't here for a punchline anymore. They were here for a human being finally stepping out of his own shadow. Steven Seagal finally uncrossed his arms. His hands rested in his lap, and his gaze settled gently on Trent. He still hadn't spoken, but his silence now felt less like a boundary and more like support. Trent looked up. I don't even remember when the performance started, but it feels like it's been going on for years. Keanu gave a slight smile. That's okay. You don't have to know when it started. You only need to decide when it ends. Trent swallowed. And what if I don't like the guy underneath? Keanu held his gaze. Then, that's the version that deserves your attention the most. The words didn't need emphasis. They just were. And somehow, that was more powerful than any monologue ever delivered from that stage. Trent exhaled one more time, longer this time. He didn't look to the cameras. He didn't reach for the microphone. He just sat in it. The stillness, the truth. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't try to escape it. He let it happen. All of it. And somewhere deep inside, something began to shift. Not in the show, in the man behind it. The air in the studio was thick, not with tension, but with something heavier. Something like reverence. Trent sat with his shoulders lower than when the interview began, his hands folded together on his lap. The audience was still. Keanu hadn't spoken in nearly a full minute, and yet no one moved to fill the silence. No music, no applause, no whispered cues, just presence. Then, quietly, from the side of the stage, a voice finally entered the conversation. You can't provoke someone who's already at peace. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The voice belonged to Steven Seagal. He hadn't spoken a single word since the show began. He had watched silently from his seat, a quiet sentinel in the shadows. But now, his words cut through the room like a chisel to marble. Trent turned his head slowly toward Steven, unsure if he had heard him correctly. The audience followed. Even the camera operators paused, reframing to catch the moment. Steven remained seated, calm, grounded. His face carried no theatrics, no intensity, just conviction. His tone was so steady it almost echoed. Trent blinked, lips parted. He looked like a man hit by something too true to dodge. Keanu's head turned gently in Steven's direction. He didn't smile. He just breathed. Trent leaned forward slightly, struggling to find a response. What do you mean by that? Steven looked at him, unmoving. Peace doesn't need to defend itself. It just exists. You've been swinging at silence all night and wondering why nothing breaks. The room froze. The impact of the sentence hadn't faded. If anything, Steven's explanation only deepened the weight of the moment. Trent looked down at his hands again, then up. That's what I've been doing, huh? Steven nodded once. Trying to provoke something that can't be shaken. That's not a fight. That's a mirror. Trent exhaled, the sound of it filling more space than any applause ever had. Keanu turned back toward him, his voice softer than before. It's hard to fight peace, because it doesn't play by the rules of noise. Trent sat back slowly in his chair. Then what do I do with all this energy, all this edge, all these reflexes I've built my identity on? Steven didn't interrupt. Keanu answered. You stop aiming them outward, you turn them inward, and you ask, what part of me is still running? Trent looked over at the audience. For years they had responded to every smirk, every one-liner, every punchy segment designed to entertain and provoke. But now, they were leaning in for a different reason. Not to laugh, but to understand. Something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in the man who built it. And no one was sure what would come next. Trent rubbed his forehead, the weight of Steven's sentence still pressing on his chest. You can't provoke someone who's already at peace, he repeated under his breath. That line, it's not just about him, is it? Steven didn't flinch. It never was. Trent turned to Keanu. You didn't come here to fight me. I came here to be here, Keanu said simply. Trent laughed, not to deflect, but in disbelief. That's the most disarming thing anyone's ever said to me. Keanu stayed still. Maybe you weren't disarmed. Maybe you were just tired of carrying so much. That struck Trent deeper than expected. His voice dropped. I've made a career out of pushing, poking, getting a rise. But tonight, I met a wall I couldn't climb over, a calm I couldn't bend. You met someone who didn't need to win, Steven said. The audience reacted with quiet astonishment. A few subtle nods, a soft exhale or two. Not applause, no one dared, just human response to something that felt truer than anything scripted. Trent leaned back in his chair, searching for words. I always thought I had to dominate the space, control the narrative. If I didn't own the moment, I'd disappear. Keanu replied softly. Maybe disappearing isn't the worst thing. Maybe it's how we remember who we are without the show. Steven added. Or maybe you're not disappearing at all. Maybe this is the first time people are actually seeing you. Trent's throat tightened. He blinked and looked away for a second, toward the ceiling. His voice cracked slightly. It's terrifying. Keanu nodded. Truth usually is. For the first time in his career, Trent let the camera catch him in silence, without masking it with movement or a smirk. His face was open, raw, and without a trace of defense. He looked back at Keanu. I didn't think you'd say much tonight. You were right. Keanu said. But sometimes not saying much allows what matters to rise. Trent's shoulders dropped. He was no longer trying to fill the air. He was letting the air tell him something instead. Steven spoke again, slower this time. Peace isn't passive. It's powerful. But you have to stop running from the noise you created, or it'll echo forever. Trent stared at him, visibly absorbing each word. You sound like a man who learned that the hard way. Steven didn't deny it. I did. Keanu looked between the two of them. That's why this moment matters, because it's the first one that wasn't planned. The room stayed still, like it had taken a vow of silence. And maybe, in some small, sacred way, it had. Trent's voice was barely audible now. You know what's strange? I don't feel embarrassed. I should. I've spent my whole life using words like weapons. But now, I just feel still. Steven nodded once. That's what peace does. It doesn't humiliate you. It invites you to rest. Trent swallowed hard, his eyes beginning to glisten again. I don't think I've rested in years. Keanu leaned forward, his tone softer than ever. Then maybe this is the first time you've arrived. Trent stared at the floor for a long moment. The room waited. The audience, once eager for entertainment, was now wrapped in the kind of silence that comes only when something real is unfolding. Not a performance, not a plot twist, just a human being coming back to himself. I always thought I had to carry it all, Trent said, his voice cracking. Be the loudest, the fastest, the cleverest. If I stopped moving, I thought I'd disappear. You didn't disappear, Keanu said. You just finally became visible. Steven's hands were now clasped between his knees, eyes lowered in quiet agreement. It's not weakness to slow down, he said. It's clarity. Trent nodded slowly. I think I finally understand what you meant, Steven. About peace. It's not about control, Steven replied. It's about surrendering to what's true. For a moment, the three men just sat there. The host, the guest, the witness. Nothing more was needed. No punchline, no pivot, no applause. Trent eventually turned toward the audience. If you came here tonight expecting a spectacle, he said gently, I'm sorry. Then he paused, looked back at Keanu. No, I'm not sorry. He faced the crowd again, because maybe what you got instead was something real. There was no applause sign blinking, no producer shouting cues through an earpiece, just a studio filled with people too moved to pretend it was just a show. Keanu said, this moment wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about uncovering what was already there. Steven added, and honoring it. Trent closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled. Then he reached forward and took off the small mic clipped to his lapel. He placed it gently on the table. Not out of defiance, out of reverence. Keanu watched him quietly, then gave him a simple nod of acknowledgement. No celebration, no performance, just presence. Steven remained quiet. The audience too. And as the lights dimmed just slightly, the energy didn't drop, it deepened. Trent, now sitting without words, looked down at his hands once more, and whispered almost to himself, you can't provoke someone who's already at peace. He looked up, and for the first time that night, he was. Trent sat with his hands clasped in front of him, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The microphone lay untouched on the table beside him, a quiet symbol of something he was no longer clinging to. For the first time since the cameras started rolling, there was no plan behind his expression, no smirk, no calculated pause, just the weight of something real resting on his chest. Keanu waited patiently. He didn't speak. He didn't push. He let the silence be what it needed to be. Trent finally broke it. I've always hated silence. Keanu didn't flinch. His posture remained relaxed. Why? Trent hesitated. Because it means I'm alone. That there's nothing to hide behind. He looked up briefly, then away again. If I'm not loud, I don't know who I am. Keanu's response came slowly. Then maybe that's exactly where you need to be. The words didn't land like a challenge. They settled like an invitation. Trent exhaled, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like surrender. I learned early that if I wasn't the fastest talker in the room, I'd be forgotten. Growing up, my dad never listened unless you were already shouting. Dinner table conversations were like war zones. So I became the loud one, the clever one, the one who interrupted first. He paused. Then I got good at it. People laughed. They listened. I built a career out of it. And I started believing that if I ever stopped, I'd disappear. Keanu nodded slowly. What you believed kept you safe, but maybe it also kept you from yourself. Trent looked him in the eye for a long moment. That's what scares me. If I let go of the persona, what's left? Someone worth knowing, Keanu said quietly. There was a long pause. Trent shook his head, not in denial but in awe. You don't flinch when people throw things at you, do you? Keanu's expression softened. There's nothing to dodge when you stop carrying the armor. Trent chuckled, but it wasn't performance, it was fatigue. Armor? Yeah, that's what it's been. Every word, every smirk, every deflection, it's all just armor. I stitched together so I wouldn't feel the cold. Then maybe it's time to feel it, Keanu replied gently. Just enough to realize you can survive it. The studio had shifted entirely. There was no stage anymore, no guest or host, no set. Just a man shedding the only version of himself he ever knew, and another man giving him permission to do it without shame. Steven Seagal hadn't spoken again, but he hadn't stopped watching. His eyes weren't judgmental, they were steady, like someone who had sat in his own silence long enough to recognize the beginning of someone else's. Trent let his hands fall open in his lap. He looked at Keanu and whispered, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's why it's real." Trent leaned back slowly, eyes drifting across the audience. "They came to see a show," he murmured, "and instead, they're watching me fall apart." Keanu shook his head. "You're not falling apart. You're falling open." Trent closed his eyes. "Do you know how many times I've rehearsed comebacks in the mirror? Whole arguments, interviews, even fights I never had. I needed to be the sharpest guy in the room because the silence terrified me." Keanu waited. "I didn't know what it would say," Trent added, "what it would reveal." Keanu replied gently, "But now you do." Trent looked up. "It reveals that I've been hiding behind applause, that I don't really know how to be with myself unless someone else is watching." The honesty stung, but it also released something. His jaw relaxed. His hands were no longer clenched. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. Like a man who had finally stopped bracing. The audience wasn't fidgeting. No one had left. No one dared look away. Steven Seagal leaned forward, placing his forearms on his thighs. Still silent, still grounded, but everything in his posture said he understood. Trent turned toward him. "You've felt it too, haven't you?" Steven gave a small nod. Trent turned back to Keanu. "You said peace doesn't defend itself, but I've been defending myself for so long I forgot what peace even looks like." Keanu's voice was steady. "It looks like this, right now." Trent's eyes brimmed again. "I always thought vulnerability was weakness, that it meant you lost." "No," Keanu said, "it means you stopped pretending." Trent stared at him for a long time. "You came here to say very little, but you've said everything I didn't know how to ask." Keanu looked at him kindly. "You didn't need to ask. You just needed to arrive." The words felt final, but not in an ending way, more like a door opening. Trent nodded slowly, wiping the corner of his eye. He looked to the audience one more time. If you're watching this and you're wondering what just happened, I don't have a script for you. I don't have a punchline. I just have this. He placed his hand over his chest. For the first time in my life, I let myself be seen. The room remained completely silent, but the air felt different, less like a studio, more like a sanctuary. Steven finally spoke, his voice low and sure. Now you know what silence can hold. Trent looked at both men, and maybe now I know who I've been avoiding all these years. He looked down, then slowly, deliberately, back up again. The mask was gone. The battle had ended, and in its place, there was something far more powerful. Not victory, but surrender. And for the first time since the camera started rolling, everyone in that room, host, guest, audience, understood. That was the real beginning. Trent's eyes were still glassy, but his posture had shifted. Not rigid, not performative, just open, vulnerable. He looked across at Keanu, then down at his hands, resting loosely on his lap. The silence in the studio continued, but it no longer felt empty. It felt necessary. There's something I haven't said out loud in a long time, Trent began slowly. Not on air, not at home, not even to myself. Keanu nodded once, encouraging him without words. Trent inhaled deeply. My son used to laugh at everything I said. When he was little, even the worst dad jokes would make him giggle until he fell over. I used to practice punchlines in the mirror before he woke up, just so I'd have something ready to make him smile. The audience didn't move. Not a cough, not a stir. They were listening like their silence could carry him safely to the end of the sentence. Trent continued, voice trembling. Somewhere along the way, that stopped. I don't know when exactly. I just know I looked at him one day, told a joke I'd rehearsed the night before, and he just looked at me. Not annoyed, not amused, just waiting. His jaw tensed. It's like he was waiting for the real me to show up. Keanu sat with him in that moment, then spoke gently. Maybe he's not waiting to laugh. Maybe he's waiting to see you. Trent nodded slowly, the tears now falling freely. And I don't even know what that means anymore. I've been a version of myself for so long, one I crafted so well. I can't tell where the act ends and I begin. He looked at the floor, ashamed. When I talk to him now, I catch myself using the same rhythms I use here. I frame stories, pause for effect, deliver zingers, and sometimes he smiles, but it's polite, empty, like he's performing for me now. Steven Seagal shifted slightly in his seat, watching the moment unfold with deep stillness. Keanu leaned forward slightly, voice low. That's how it happens. We pass the performance down. Not intentionally, just unconsciously. Trent nodded. I never wanted that for him. You didn't fail him, Keanu said. You just haven't shown him the part of you that doesn't need a stage. Trent took another breath. Last week he asked me if I was ever serious about anything. It came out of nowhere. We were eating pancakes, just me, him, and his mom, and out of nowhere he looks at me and says, "Are you ever just real?" He wiped at his face with the back of his hand. I told him, of course I am. Then I made some dumb joke to lighten it, and he didn't laugh. He just nodded. Quietly. Keanu's voice was steady. He saw the disconnect. Trent nodded again, and I felt it. He looked up at Keanu, his face full of regret. I think I've been talking so much I stopped knowing how to speak to the people who matter most. Keanu let the words breathe. Then he said, that's the cost of the performance. It protects you from judgment, but it also protects others from knowing who you are. Trent leaned back slightly, his eyes distant. He used to ask me to read him bedtime stories. Now he just puts on his headphones. And I tell myself it's just a phase, that he's getting older. But deep down, I know I started disappearing before he pulled away. Keanu nodded with quiet empathy. He's not pulling away, he's waiting. Trent's voice was almost a whisper now. Waiting for what? For his father to step out from behind the mask, Keanu said. For the man who doesn't need an audience to be honest. Steven's voice came in low but clear. Kids are the first to know when you're pretending. They might not say it, but they feel it. Trent looked at him, surprised but grateful. Did your kids go through that with you? Steven didn't elaborate. He just said, I had to earn their trust back. Not with gifts, not with words, with presence. Trent's lips pressed into a line, eyes rimmed with red. I don't know how to be present without trying to impress. You don't have to impress, Keanu said. You just have to be there. Really be there. Trent looked down. It's hard. Sitting in a room and not knowing who you are, without the clever line, without the spin, without the armor. That's when the real you shows up, Keanu replied. When the other voices go quiet. Trent let the thought sink in. Then he looked back toward the audience. I didn't expect to talk about any of this. I thought I'd keep it light, stay in control, toss a few jabs and move on. He paused. But then he asked me if I was ever real, and I haven't been able to stop hearing it since. Keanu watched him carefully. Do you want to answer him? Trent nodded. More than anything. Then start now. Trent turned his gaze back to the camera, the same camera he'd faced for years with perfect timing and crafted sarcasm. But now his voice was different, slower, unpolished. He spoke as if his son were on the other side of the lens. I don't know what version of me you've grown up with, the guy on the screen, the guy with the comeback, but I want you to know, I hear you. And I see now that being real doesn't mean being flawless. It just means being honest. He swallowed hard, fighting the crack in his voice. I miss laughing with you. Not because I'm funny, but because we're connected. I want that back. I want you to see the version of me that's not on air. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Keanu placed a hand over his heart. Just for a moment, and Trent closed his eyes, breathing in the first moment of truth he'd spoken in years. The atmosphere in the studio was no longer electric. It was still, charged not with performance, but with presence. You could feel it, not just in the silence, but in the way the audience had shifted forward in their seats. There were no more laughs, no more tension, just breath, just listening. Trent sat back in his chair, the words he'd just spoken to his son still hanging in the air. His fingertips brushed the edge of his cue cards as if out of habit. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he picked them up. He stared at them, reading the questions he'd been so proud to write. One was circled in bold ink. Why do people think Keanu is deep? He barely talks. He turned it over and set it on the desk. Then the next one. Another card had a line that read, Ask about the monk rumors. Push hard. He flipped that one too. And then, one by one, he laid them all down. Face down. Until the desk was clear. The audience watched, unsure of what was happening. Was this part of the show? Then Trent reached up to his right ear and pulled out his earpiece. The tiny device that had fed him producer prompts, commercial breaks, and scripted transitions for over a decade. He laid it on the desk beside the cue cards. It made the faintest click as it touched the wood. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Trent exhaled, then looked around the studio. The lights hadn't dimmed, the cameras were still rolling, but the show was gone. Or maybe for the first time, it had just started. He turned to Keanu. I don't know how to be real. The sentence didn't carry shame. It wasn't defensive, it was just honest. Raw, stripped of the cleverness that usually wrapped every word he spoke. Keanu nodded. You just did. Trent stared at him, processing that. Then he looked out into the audience and repeated the sentence to himself under his breath. You just did. His voice cracked on the second time. Steven Seagal sat quietly, his arms now crossed, not in defiance, but almost as if protecting the moment. He didn't need to speak again. He'd said enough. Trent rubbed his hands together, then pressed them against his knees. This show has been my identity. It's the only place where I felt like I mattered, like I had control. Keanu replied softly, "Then maybe letting go of control is how you'll find out who you really are." Trent looked over at him. "Is that what you did?" Keanu nodded slightly. "It's what I'm still doing." There was a pause. Then Trent leaned forward, elbows on the desk, head slightly bowed. "I've made a career out of poking holes in other people's lives, because it felt safer than looking at my own." Keanu didn't speak. He just let the silence do the work. Trent continued, "But now that I've stopped, now that I've actually said something that matters, I'm scared it's too late." Keanu leaned forward too. "It's never too late to meet yourself." Trent looked up again. "Do you really believe that?" "I do." Trent took another breath. It was shaky, but it was honest. "I think I've been addicted to being in control. Like if I just stayed 2 steps ahead, no one could touch the parts of me I didn't want them to see." Keanu gave a faint nod. "But those parts are the ones we all need to see. That's where the connection is." There was a subtle rustle from the audience, not from movement, but from emotion. Some people wiped their eyes. Others simply held on to their seats, unsure what to do with the unexpected tenderness. Trent turned to them, his voice clear but quiet. "I used to think the best thing I could do on this show was win. Outwit, outsmart, keep the audience entertained by keeping my guests off balance." He paused. "But I was wrong." No one interrupted. "The best thing I can do is be a mirror, not a weapon." He glanced over at the now silent teleprompter. "This screen used to tell me what to say, but the moment I said something from in here," he tapped his chest, "something changed." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Trent looked back at him. "I used to think you were an act, the whole quiet man persona. But now I think, maybe you're just not performing." "I'm not," Keanu replied. "And the hardest part of that is letting people misunderstand you." Trent swallowed hard. "I've misunderstood a lot of people." Keanu gently said, "That's okay, we're all learning." There was no applause sign, no forced laughter, just quiet understanding. Trent turned back to the camera. "To everyone who's watched this show for years, I don't know what happens next. Maybe this episode never airs. Maybe it's the end of something. But I think it might be the beginning of something else." The control room didn't cut away. The producer didn't yell into his headset. No commercials, no interruption. Trent said, "I've spent most of my life hiding behind words. Tonight, I found silence. And in that silence, I found something more honest than anything I've ever said." Keanu's eyes shimmered with quiet appreciation. "Sometimes silence is the only place where truth feels safe enough to speak." Trent leaned back again. He looked like a man who had just taken off a heavy coat he didn't know he was wearing. The cameras kept rolling, but for the first time, there was no performance left to film. Only truth. And somehow, that was more than enough. For a long moment, no one spoke. The energy in the studio had shifted so completely that even the cameras seemed hesitant to capture it. But then Keanu leaned slightly forward, his eyes steady, his tone softer than before. "There's something I've never really talked about on air," he began. "Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't know how to say it without unraveling." Trent didn't interrupt. He didn't reach for a follow-up. He simply listened. Keanu took a quiet breath. "My sister, Kim, was diagnosed with leukemia in the 90s. She was young, beautiful, fierce. She fought that disease for over a decade." You could hear the stillness settle over the room again. "I was filming action movies, dodging bullets on camera, smiling on red carpets. And every night I'd go home to a world that felt like it was collapsing. He paused, letting the words land. People would say I was stoic, calm, mysterious. He gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. But really, I was just trying to breathe without falling apart. A woman in the front row pressed a tissue to her face. In the back, a man reached for his partner's hand. Keanu continued. There were nights I'd sit by her hospital bed, reading to her, sometimes just to stay awake, sometimes to pretend we were somewhere else. Anywhere else. Steven, who had been silent for most of the show, nodded slowly. He didn't speak, but there was something in his face, a shared understanding that didn't need words. Keanu's voice didn't waver, but you could feel the weight in every syllable. I remember once, during an interview, someone asked me what it was like to be so successful. I smiled. I gave a polite answer. And then I went home and helped Kim to the bathroom, because her legs had stopped working that day. He let out a quiet breath. It's strange how we can live in two realities at once. The world sees one version, while we hold another close to the chest. Trent leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. He looked humbled. How did you keep going? Keanu shook his head slowly. Sometimes I didn't. I just moved. One step. One scene. One moment at a time. Trent nodded with understanding, and when she passed, Keanu looked down for a moment, then back up. The world kept moving, the cameras kept rolling, and I kept pretending that it was okay. There was no performance in his tone, just memory, just pain wrapped in quiet. He continued, Grief doesn't go away. It changes shape. Some days it whispers, some days it roars. But it never really leaves. Steven, still quiet, placed a hand on the armrest beside him, as if grounding himself, as if saying without words, I know. Keanu looked toward the ceiling for a moment, then continued. What made it harder was the world didn't know. And that's not the world's fault. But it meant that every smile I gave felt like a lie. Every handshake, every laugh, it felt borrowed. Like I was living on a loan from a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. The audience was silent, completely immersed in the rawness of the moment. No one shuffled, no one coughed, just eyes fixed on a man who had mastered stillness until that stillness was finally allowed to speak. Trent swallowed. Why share this now? Keanu looked at him with quiet eyes. Because maybe someone out there is trying to hold it all together too, and maybe they need to know they're not weak for feeling like they can't. He paused. I wish someone had told me that. A murmur rippled softly through the crowd. Less sound, more emotion finding its way through breath. Trent leaned back, visibly shaken but grounded. We joke on this show. We pry, we push, but this is something different. Keanu gave the faintest nod. We all wear armor, but grief doesn't knock. It walks right through. Steven finally spoke, his voice low and steady. And when it walks in, the only thing you can do is sit with it. Keanu looked over at him. Their eyes met. Two men once framed by toughness and action rules, now bound by something much deeper, sorrow, acceptance, presence. Steven added, I lost my mother in 2003. I was in the middle of a shoot. Nobody knew. I went back to work the next day, not because I was strong, but because I didn't know what else to do. Keanu nodded once. We're taught to keep going, but sometimes stopping is the bravest thing. Trent folded his hands together on the desk. If you could speak to your sister now, what would you say? Keanu looked down at his lap. He thought for a long moment. I'd say I miss you. I'd say I'm sorry for all the days I wasn't fully present because I thought work couldn't wait. I'd say thank you for being the light when everything around us got dark. Then he added quietly, and I'd tell her I'm still walking with her. No one moved. The room felt frozen in reverence. Steven closed his eyes for a beat, then opened them again. Some people think grief is weakness, but it's not. It's the deepest proof of love. Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. She once said, "Don't be afraid of the dark. It's where the stars live." I think about that all the time. Trent pressed his fingertips together. Then, maybe this whole show, maybe it was meant to be more than a takedown. Maybe it was meant to remind people that beneath all the noise, we're all just carrying something. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. And sometimes, sharing it doesn't make it lighter, but it makes it less lonely. The lights in the studio didn't dim, and no one gave a cue. But somehow, the moment shifted again. The laughter from earlier felt like it had belonged to another universe, one so distant it couldn't reach the present. Trent leaned forward and gently set his stack of cue cards on the table. He didn't toss them, he didn't shred them. He just placed them down like something sacred and tired. "You know," he said quietly, "this show was never really about truth." Keanu looked over, his expression calm, open. Trent's eyes flicked toward the camera crew, then back to Keanu. "We sold the idea that we were exposing reality, pulling back the curtain, but it wasn't truth. It was control." He gave a slow exhale. "We picked the questions. We shaped the narrative. We edited the pauses, cut the silences. Everything was polished and packaged to keep things moving, to keep people entertained. And the worst part is, I convinced myself I was doing something important." Keanu didn't interrupt. Trent's voice broke a little. "I thought if I could keep the illusion sharp enough, no one would look behind it, not even me." Keanu leaned in slightly and said, "The truth doesn't need control. It just needs space." There was no music swell, no dramatic zoom. Just two men sitting, still, in a space that had finally made room for honesty. Trent let the words settle. He looked toward the audience, who were still hanging on every moment, not because they were waiting for a punchline, but because something in the room felt sacred now. A shared reverence for what had just been broken open. "I was afraid," Trent admitted, his voice now stripped of its usual swagger. "Afraid that if I didn't lead the moment, I'd vanish inside it." Keanu nodded gently. "But the moment isn't trying to erase you, it's just trying to meet you." Trent stared at him, eyes moist with the weight of years unspoken. "No one's ever talked to me like this on my own show. That's probably why it had to happen," Keanu replied. Then it happened. The silence. No one filled it. The crew didn't cut to commercial. There were no graphics or voiceovers. Just silence. A full minute. Two men, one known for his words, the other known for his stillness, sat beside each other on live television and said nothing. No tension, no discomfort. His breath. Just presence. It was a silence that didn't demand anything. It didn't rush to be productive. It simply existed. Like the eye of a storm, after everything false had been stripped away. In that quiet, the brand of the show, its sharp edge, its branding, its identity, was gone. And in its place sat two human beings, who no longer needed roles. When Trent finally spoke again, it wasn't to reclaim control, it was to release it. "I think I built this show because I was afraid to be invisible," Trent said slowly. "Like if I wasn't constantly loud, clever, or controversial, I'd disappear." Keanu didn't respond with pity or judgment. He just listened, leaning into the quiet like it had something to teach them both. Trent went on. "You know, the first time someone told me I was good at this, it wasn't after an honest interview. It was after I humiliated someone on live TV, got a viral moment out of it. The producers called it genius. The numbers were great." He paused, staring at the monitors off stage. "That moment changed my career, but it also changed me. I started chasing that high, shock over sincerity, laughter over listening." Keanu folded his hands. "Sometimes the worst reward is the one that works." Trent looked stunned for a second, as if someone had spoken aloud a secret he never admitted to himself. "I don't know how to do anything else," he admitted. Keanu shook his head slightly. "I think you do, you just forgot." There was another pause, shorter this time, but no less powerful. Trent ran his hand over his mouth. "Do you think people will still watch if I change?" Keanu looked at him, not with certainty, but with peace. "Maybe they'll finally see you." A low exhale escaped Trent's chest. It was the sound of armor slipping off the shoulders of a man who had worn it for too long. Behind the cameras, no one moved. No one dared. Even the stage crew sensed it. The story had changed. This wasn't a segment anymore. It was something heavier, truer. A studio that had hosted 1,000 performances had, for once, become a place of confession. Trent leaned back in his chair and looked at Keanu. "You've made a lot of people feel seen tonight." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "So have you." Trent gave a faint laugh, not bitter this time, just real. "It's funny. I set this show up to control every moment, but the moment that matters most, I didn't script it, didn't plan it." "That's how you know it's true," Keanu said. The lights on set seemed softer now. The air wasn't as thick. And still, no music played. No teleprompter resumed. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Steven Seagal, who had remained quiet since his earlier sentence, gave a small nod. He didn't need to say more. His words had already landed. Trent looked directly into the camera, something he rarely did outside of dramatic intros. "If you're still watching," he said, voice raw, "thank you. Not for your loyalty, not for your clicks, but for giving space to something that wasn't meant to entertain, just to be." He turned back to Keanu. "Thank you for sitting here, not as a celebrity, just as a person." Keanu smiled gently. "It's the only way I know how." And once again they sat together. No applause sign lit up. No cues rolled in. Just two men no longer performing. And for the first time in the show's history, silence closed the segment. Not as a pause, but as the point. The stillness held. A kind of sacred air filled the studio. Not staged silence, but earned silence. One that rose from the ashes of broken performance. Steven Seagal shifted in his seat. For nearly the entire interview, he had been a silent observer, a presence in the periphery. Now he slowly leaned forward, elbows resting gently on his knees, eyes locked not on the camera or the crowd, but on Trent. "The man who stops performing isn't weak," Steven said. "He's finally free." There was no flourish, no spotlight, just a quiet voice cutting through years of noise. Trent's head dropped almost immediately. It was like someone had touched the exact point in his chest where all the pressure lived. The mask didn't fall this time. He laid it down himself. His lip trembled, his shoulders rose and fell in one sharp breath, then another. The weight of decades spilled forward, and then the tears came. Not the kind meant to gain sympathy, not the kind squeezed out for dramatic effect, but the real kind. The tears of a man who finally stopped running. Trent looked at Steven through blurry eyes and said, "Then maybe tonight's the first night I've lived in a long time." Keanu placed a hand over his heart, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that had just surfaced. The audience didn't move. Some had tears in their eyes. Others held hands over their mouths, unsure whether they were witnessing a breakdown or a breakthrough. But in that moment, the difference didn't matter. What mattered was that something real had finally made its way to the surface. Trent looked up, wiping his face with the sleeve of his blazer. "I don't know what to do with this," he whispered. "I've spent so long trying to be someone people couldn't look away from." "You still are," Keanu said gently. "But for a different reason now." Steven nodded. "They're not watching to be entertained anymore. They're watching because they see you." Trent sat back, breath shaky, eyes red. "I thought if I ever cracked like this on camera, it'd be the end of everything." Keanu smiled slightly. "What if it's the beginning?" Steven leaned back again, his role fulfilled. He didn't need to say anything more. That one sentence, calm, measured, powerful, had done what no script or soundbite ever could. It had made space for release. The crew began to shift quietly behind the cameras. There were no instructions, just subtle movement. A few camera operators lowered their equipment. One of the producers wiped away a tear. Trent looked out into the darkened crowd and whispered, "I don't know who I am when I'm not performing." Keanu responded without hesitation. "That's how you know it's time to find out." Silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was charged with a new presence, a presence that said something had shifted, and it wasn't going back. Trent took off his microphone, not angrily, not dramatically, just slowly, with reverence. Then he looked at Keanu. "Why did you come on this show?" Keanu tilted his head thoughtfully. "Because someone told me you were hurting, and I thought maybe silence would reach you where noise never could." Trent blinked slowly. His lips parted, but no words came out right away. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Well, it did." He looked at the floor. "I've spent years pretending to be fearless, but every night when the lights go off and the crew goes home, I sit in my dressing room wondering if I said enough to matter, or if I just said enough to distract." Keanu didn't speak. He just stayed with him in the quiet. "And the worst part," Trent continued, "is that I trained myself to keep going even when I knew I was hurting people, guests, audiences, sometimes even myself. I called it honesty, but it wasn't honesty, it was armor." Keanu finally spoke. "The truth is soft. If it feels like a weapon, it's not truth." Trent shook his head slowly. "I thought vulnerability made me weak. I thought I had to control the narrative before anyone else could twist it." "You don't need to twist anything when you're telling the truth," Keanu replied. A long breath filled the space between them. Then Trent looked at Steven Seagal. "Why did you speak when you did?" Steven didn't rush. His voice was deep but calm. "Because I saw myself in you. Years ago, I was the guy who thought toughness meant silence, stoicism. But real strength, real freedom, it comes when you stop performing." Trent swallowed hard. Steven leaned forward again. "And I saw the moment you were ready." Trent gave a broken laugh. "I didn't feel ready." "That's how you know it's real," Steven said. Another pause. Another breath. Then Trent turned to Keanu. "You've been through hell. Loss, grief, betrayal, but somehow you carry peace. How?" Keanu thought for a moment. "I don't carry peace," he said softly. "I just stopped carrying things that weren't mine." Trent looked confused. "Like what?" "Other people's opinions, their expectations, their versions of who I'm supposed to be." Trent's eyes welled up again. "I don't know who I am without those things." "You're about to find out," Keanu said. "And I think it might be beautiful." That final word landed like a whisper in a chapel. Beautiful. The idea that there could be beauty in undoing everything you built for the wrong reasons. Trent sat quietly for several moments. He looked around the studio that once felt like his domain. The lights, the crew, the cameras, it all looked different now. Not threatening, not performative, just human. The employee who dared to ask. "I don't know what happens after this," Trent said. Steven nodded. "Maybe that's the best thing that could happen to you." The three men sat together. Not as icons, not as host and guests, just as people. Wounded, weary, but somehow more whole than before. There was no outro music, no fancy wrap-up, just a room full of people finally breathing without performance. And in the quiet, Trent whispered one final sentence to himself. I think I'm ready to stop pretending. No one applauded. No one needed to. The silence was enough. Trent Wallace didn't adjust his suit. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't turn to the teleprompter or glance at a producer for a cue. He just looked up, directly into the camera. Not the performance lens, the real one. "If you're watching this," he began slowly, "and you're tired of pretending, I see you." The air in the studio changed again, not because of what he said, but how he said it. No spin, no smirk, just truth. He let the silence settle. "I've been you," he said. No camera angles cut, no dramatic zoom, just one steady frame on a man slowly laying his pride down, in real time. "I've been the guy who wears the jokes like armor, the guy who acts like he's okay because everyone expects him to be okay, the one who's scared to stop talking because the silence might expose something you don't know how to fix." His voice didn't waver, but it was quieter than usual, honest quiet. "I know what it's like to look successful on the outside but feel like a fraud the moment the lights go down. I know what it's like to keep saying clever things when all you want is to be understood." In the front row, a woman in her 60s wiped her eyes with a tissue she hadn't needed all evening. Next to her, a young man in a hoodie leaned forward with his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on Trent, like the words were unlocking something he hadn't let himself feel in years. "I've made a career out of talking," Trent said, his voice now softer. "And for the first time tonight, I think I finally said something that mattered." He looked down briefly, then back into the lens. "I want to say something to the people who always feel like they're on, at work, at home, even with friends, the ones who don't know how to shut off the show because they're scared they won't be loved without it." He paused again. "You don't need to be funny all the time, or strong all the time, or successful, or composed, or impressive. You don't have to earn love. You just have to be." A deep breath came, but not the anxious kind, the settling kind. "And if no one's ever said it to you before, I will. You're allowed to stop pretending. You're allowed to be exactly as you are. Scared, unsure, tired, or even messy." No music swelled in the background, no cue lights flashed. The producers didn't cut to commercial. They just let it happen. "I used to think that vulnerability would cost me everything," Trent continued. "My credibility, my job, my sense of self. But tonight I realized it might be the only honest thing I have left." He looked over at Keanu and Steven. Both men sat still, present, available. And if these two legends can sit here without needing to dominate the room or outshine each other, maybe I can too. Maybe we all can. More than a few people in the crowd nodded slowly. The usual hum of a live audience was gone, replaced by something deeper, presence. Trent leaned forward just slightly, resting his hands on the desk, not with showmanship, but with sincerity. "I don't know what you expected when you tuned in tonight. Maybe some scandal, some breakdown, or some viral takedown. Maybe you expected Keanu Reeves to be roasted and walk away looking confused. Maybe you came for entertainment." He paused, his eyes still fixed on the camera. "But I hope, somewhere in all this, you found something else, something quieter, something deeper, maybe even something you didn't know you needed." A few audience members closed their eyes briefly, as if listening not with their ears, but with their hearts. "I'm not going to pretend I have the answers," Trent said, almost smiling. "For most of my life, I've survived by pretending I did. But Keanu reminded me of something tonight. He didn't do it with cleverness or with comebacks. He did it with stillness." He turned to Keanu, then back to the lens. "There's something disarming about being in the presence of someone who doesn't need to perform. It makes you ask yourself why you've spent so long trying to be enough, when maybe you already were." Another pause. "If you've lost someone, if you're carrying pain that no one sees, if you feel like you're screaming behind a smile, I want to say this clearly." He took a breath. "You are not alone." A single light above the stage flickered softly, then stilled. I used to believe silence meant weakness, that if I stopped talking, I'd lose control. But I've come to realize that silence is where healing begins. It's where truth lives. It's where the noise stops and the real you gets to speak. There was no soundtrack playing, but the weight of the moment didn't need it. Trent sat back slightly, his expression less polished, more human. This might not be good TV, but maybe it's a good moment. And that's more important. Someone in the audience whispered, "Yes," under their breath. It wasn't for applause, it was for resonance. No one coached me to say this. There's no producer feeding me lines. This isn't rehearsed. It's just me telling the truth. He folded his hands loosely, lowering them to the desk. If you're someone who's built a life out of noise, I encourage you, just once, to try stillness. Just once, try telling the truth to yourself, even if it scares you. He looked toward the studio walls, then back into the lens one last time. And if this is the last episode I ever host, I'd be okay with that. Because tonight, I finally showed up. No one clapped. No one needed to. Steven Seagal gave a single nod, solemn and grounded. Keanu looked at Trent with that same unwavering calm. And across millions of screens around the world, people didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. They didn't scroll away. They sat. They breathed. They felt. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. And for the first time in Trent Wallace's long, noisy career, he let that silence speak. The studio lights had dimmed. The last camera powered down. The applause signs, the earpieces, the stage crew chatter, all faded into a hush that wasn't awkward, but sacred. Backstage, the room felt different now. Not like a green room filled with celebrity tension, not like a holding space for egos, but more like a chapel after a storm. Quiet, honest, human. Trent sat on a black leather couch, shoulders lowered, tie loosened. His hands, usually active with performance gestures, rested still in his lap. Keanu sat across from him, sipping from a glass of water, his eyes soft but focused. Steven Seagal stood near the wall, arms crossed, but his posture was relaxed. He hadn't spoken again since that last sentence. But he didn't need to. The three men didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. Finally, Trent exhaled, breaking the silence without breaking its weight. "I used to think silence meant irrelevance," he said, quietly. "Like, if you weren't speaking, if you weren't controlling the room, you didn't matter." Keanu nodded slowly. "I built a whole career around making noise," Trent added. "But tonight, it felt like the first time I actually heard anything." Steven gave a soft grunt of agreement. Trent turned to Keanu, his voice unsteady but grateful. "Thank you. For not fighting me, for not trying to win, for just holding your ground without shoving mine away." Keanu gave a small smile, the kind that doesn't push but welcomes. "You weren't my enemy," he said. "You were just loud because something inside needed to be heard." Trent's eyes welled again, but this time without fear of what it meant. There were no cameras now, no edits, no "I always thought being silent meant losing the audience," Trent admitted. Keanu leaned forward gently. "Maybe it doesn't mean losing them," he said. "Maybe it means giving them a place to find themselves." Steven finally stepped closer, his boots making a single soft tap on the concrete floor. "The loudest people in the room," he said, "are usually the ones who've never been allowed to cry." That line settled over the space like warm fog. Trent looked at both men and said, "Then maybe tonight, I finally gave myself permission." He laughed quietly through his tears. "Weirdest episode of my career, and somehow, the most important." Keanu took another sip of water, then placed the glass down. "It's not weird," he said. "It's becoming." Trent blinked, tilting his head. "What do you mean?" Keanu looked at him with kindness. "You thought silence meant emptiness. but maybe it was just the sound of becoming who you really are. The words didn't land like a quote. They landed like truth, not polished, not dramatic, just whole. The room stayed silent for another moment, but this time, it wasn't because there was nothing to say. It was because something had been said that didn't need explaining. Then Trent stood, not abruptly, but with intention. He walked over to Keanu and offered his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing through the noise." Keanu stood too, took his hand and nodded. Steven gave a small clap. "Just one," then said, "Let's not ruin it with a punchline." They all laughed softly. Not as performers, as people. Back in the empty studio, the monitors still glowed faint blue. The chairs sat in perfect rows, holding the echo of a night no one expected. And for the millions who would rewatch this episode later, it wouldn't be the sound bites they'd remember. It would be the quiet, the becoming. Hours later, after most of the crew had gone home and the last cup of lukewarm coffee had been discarded, Trent remained in the studio, alone. He walked out onto the empty set. No audience, no pressure. Just rows of silent chairs and the lingering shadow of something real. He stood where Keanu had sat, looked at the chair that once held Seagal, then turned slowly to face the camera, now off, its little red light no longer blinking. Still, he spoke as if someone might hear. "To whoever ends up watching that episode," he said aloud to the quiet, "I hope it hits you somewhere you've been ignoring." He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just nodded, once, to the invisible crowd he finally didn't need to impress. Meanwhile, in a quiet hallway, Keanu and Steven walked side by side, not talking, just walking, their steps echoing across the tile floor. Steven eventually broke the silence. "You think he'll be okay?" Keanu looked ahead, then replied, "He was never broken, just buried." Steven didn't respond right away. Then he nodded. "That's the difference, isn't it?" Keanu didn't say more. He didn't need to. They reached the exit. Outside, the city pulsed as it always had, horns blaring, neon glowing, people rushing to nowhere. But in that small pocket of stillness behind the studio walls, something had shifted. Not loudly, but permanently. By the next morning, social media exploded, not in scandal, but in stunned reverence. Clips of the silent moments went viral. Not the gotcha lines, not the memes, just the quiet. People were posting things like, "This moment healed something I didn't know was broken," and "I've never seen vulnerability handled like this on TV." And then there was one comment, shared thousands of times. Keanu didn't win, Trent didn't lose. They just stopped fighting. And it was the most powerful thing I've ever seen. That comment hit the homepage of multiple platforms. It wasn't a headline, it was a mirror. Later that week, Trent released a statement. No PR firm, no lawyers, just a simple post. "I'm not sure what I'm doing anymore, but I know I'm done performing, thanks to Keanu and Steven and every viewer who stayed with us through the silence. I thought I was being irrelevant. Turns out, I was becoming human." That statement went untouched by news outlets trying to sensationalize it. It was too soft to exploit, too whole to spin. And for Keanu, there was no celebration, no victory lap, just another morning where he poured his coffee, fed his dog, and took a quiet walk through the neighborhood. But something lingered from that night, a reminder that not every voice has to be loud to be heard, that not every silence is emptiness. Sometimes it's the beginning of something truthful, a becoming. Now to you, the one still watching, still listening. Have you ever been afraid of silence? Not just the absence of noise, but the presence of truth it carries? Have you ever filled every room with laughter, chatter, or sarcasm just to avoid hearing your own heartbeat? Maybe you've never been on a stage, maybe you've never interviewed a celebrity, but maybe You've pretended too long, smiled too wide, spoke too fast, laughed too loud. And maybe, just maybe, the moment you stop performing isn't when you vanish. Maybe it's when you finally arrive. So take this story with you, not as entertainment, but as an invitation to breathe, to pause, to listen to yourself without the performance. And if this story reached something in you, even a little, tell us in the comments. Have you ever been afraid of silence? What does becoming mean to you? We'd love to hear your story. And if you believe in the power of honesty, of quiet moments that change everything, subscribe. Sometimes, the strongest voices are the ones that don't need to shout. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the silence.